Hi, welcome to another session on legal studies. Today, we are going to cover a very important topic, a topic which is very important from business perspective, but also equally important for CUET. If you look at the weightage of the topic, this is one of the most frequently covered area in all the law entrances after class 12th. Today, we are going to learn about law of contracts. Contracts are a very essential part of our lives. Considering the importance of this chapter from CUET perspective, we'll cover the lesson in two parts. Today, in this session, we are going to learn about agreements, contracts, how to differentiate between an agreement and a contract, and we'll also look at the essential elements which make a contract. So let's begin the first part based on law of contracts. Contracts are a very integral part of our lives. Knowingly, unknowingly, we enter into contract almost every day. When we go to a restaurant and order food, when we book a cab ride, we enter into a contract. But one of the challenges is to differentiate between an agreement and a contract. We'll learn with a lot of examples how to differentiate between an agreement and a contract because they are used frequently and interchangeably. For example, when the landlord hands over the key to the tenant along with the document and says, please sign the contract, it creates an uncertainty whether the document is an agreement or a contract. Let's look at another situation. If your father says that if you score 90% in your class 12th exam, I will give you a sports bike. You work hard, get 100% in your exam, but your father does not deliver his promise. Can you sue your father in the court of law? Think over it. We have often seen contract killers in the movies who kill people for money. What if the contract killer fails to execute his part of the promise? Will the party giving the contract to the killer will be able to go to a court of law for the breach of contract? I'm sure there are a lot of such examples where you'll see the clear confusion about an agreement and a contract. An agreement to go for a walk, to go to a movie, to play some game, or to entertain someone over dinner cannot be enforced in the eyes of law. Can you enforce these agreements? Of course not. These are mere social commitments. So how do we differentiate between an agreement and a contract? It seems very complex, but once you start learning, you will realize they are very easy to understand. What is more important is to figure out the intention of the parties who are entering into a contract. The intention must be to create a legally binding relationship and not a mere social commitment. where the parties know or intend that if the other party fails to keep his promise of the contract, there would be no legally binding relationship and there will be consequences. So when your father promises you to give you a sports bike if you score 90% in your exam, but fails to deliver his promise even after you have scored 100%, you can't go to a court of law because that's a mere social commitment which cannot be enforced in the court of law. Only the agreements which are enforceable, please understand, only the agreements which are enforceable in the court of law can be considered a contract, or they become a contract. In other words, all contracts are agreements, but all agreements are not contracts. An agreement, in a simple word, is a promise or a set of promise forming the consideration for each other. If we talk about the Indian context, it is the Indian Contract Law 1872 which defines the contract. Contracts are an important part of our business because all transactions usually begin with an agreement or a contract. Sale purchase, exchange of services are integral to day-to-day business activities. Accordingly, an agreement or a contract becomes necessary to determine the rights, liabilities, and consequences of the parties involved in the contract. In India, as I said earlier, it is the Indian Contract Act 1872 which governs contract. And according to ICA, Section 2H, an agreement which can be enforced in the court of law can only be considered a contract. So in order to qualify as a contract, there are certain elements, there are certain conditions which the agreement must fulfill. The agreement must be by the free consent of the parties involved. Free consent is very important for an agreement to become a contract. We'll discuss this all in detail in the later half of this session. The parties involved must be competent to enter into a contract. As per ICA, there are certain conditions laid down where a person cannot enter into a contract with another person. It is also important that the agreement must be of lawful consideration with a lawful object and should not be considered or declared void by the court of law. The parties must have an intention and mindset, very important to understand. The parties must have intention and the mindset to enter into a contract. Very important is to understand how a third party looks at the contract. Whether the third party looking at the contract would think of the parties intending into a contract to create a legally binding relationship. A very important concept when it comes to contract is privity of contract. Now, what exactly is privity of contract? According to this concept, the contract grants rights to only the persons who have entered into a contract and not to any other third person, even if such person is deriving a benefit out of that contract. I am sure by now you are clear how to differentiate between an agreement and a contract. Let's move on to understand what are the essential elements for an agreement to become a contract. And here you need to pay attention. Once you have understood the essential elements, it will be easier for you to differentiate between an agreement and a contract. The very first element when it comes to an agreement becoming a contract is offer and acceptance. What is an offer? An offer is a proposal and it is the first step towards making a contract. अगर ऑफर नहीं होगा तो कॉन्ट्रैक्ट नहीं बनेगा, क्योंकि बिना ऑफर के एक्सेप्टेंस नहीं हो सकता है. So offer and acceptance is a very essential element to form a contract. Offer is the willingness or a specific set of terms made with the intention that it shall become binding as soon as it is accepted by the other party to whom this promise has been addressed. Which means when offer has been communicated to the other party, when it has been addressed to the other party, it has done with an intention that once that other party accept the terms and conditions of the contract, it becomes legally binding on both the parties. The person making the offer is known as an offerer, and the one who is accepting the offers is known as an offeree. तो इसको याद रखना, जो भी ऑफर दे रहा है उसको हम लोग ऑफरर बुलाते हैं या प्रॉमिसर बुलाते हैं. वी कॉल देम ऑफरर और प्रॉमिसर, द पर्सन हु इज मेकिंग द ऑफर, एंड द पर्सन हु इज एक्सेप्टिंग द ऑफर इज नोन एज an offeree or a promisee. I hope it is clear. Now, what exactly is acceptance? Acceptance is an expression of absolute and unconditional. Please pay focus here. It's a absolute and unconditional consent to all the terms set out in the offer. तो ऑफर में जो भी टर्म्स एंड कंडीशंस हैं बिल्कुल उसी तरीके से उसको एक्सेप्ट करना होगा. देन ओनली एक्सेप्टेंस इज कंसिडर्ड टू बी वैलिड, विच मीन्स द एक्सेप्टेंस मस्ट बी द एग्जैक्ट मिरर इमेज ऑफ द ऑफर. लेट अस ट्राई दिस विथ एन एग्जाम्पल. A makes an offer to B to sell his car for rupees 5 lakhs. B is keen to buy that car for rupees 4 lakhs. Is there an acceptance? No. Why not? Because the acceptance has to be the mirror image. Here, the terms change. The money which A is asking is rupees 5 lakhs, but the money which B is giving is rupees 4 lakhs. So it is not the mirror image which is being formed. The acceptance is not on the same terms and conditions. तो कार है but amount change हो रहा है, जो consideration हम बोलते हैं. A के set में कार इज द कंसिडरेशन, बी के कंडीशन में द मनी इज द कंसिडरेशन. यहां पे जो कंसिडरेशन है, विल टॉक अबाउट दैट, जो कंसिडरेशन है वो बी ने चेंज कर दिया है. बी इज चेंजिंग द कंसिडरेशन, द वैल्यू विच इज नाउ 4 lakhs. ही इज सेइंग 4 lakhs. सो द एक्सेप्टेंस इज नॉट based in the same sense as the offer was made. So an offer, when accepted, becomes an agreement. So mathematically you can say offer plus acceptance is equal to agreement. But the acceptance has to be in the same sense, for the same consideration. Nothing should change over here. So what has been communicated, the set of promises which we call offer, it has to be accepted in the same manner, same sense. तभी वो agreement बनेगा. Offer and acceptance must be clear. It must be definite. It must be certain. If it is not clear enough to form a contract, it is considered invalid. तो जो ऑफर और एक्सेप्टेंस के टर्म्स एंड कंडीशंस हैं वो बिल्कुल क्लियर होने चाहिए. देयर शुड बी नो एम्बिग्विटी आउट देयर. इफ देयर इज एनी एम्बिग्विटी और एनी चेंज इन द टर्म्स, then it will be considered invalid. It is also important to understand that the offer as well as acceptance must be communicated to the other person to make it valid. You make an offer to sell your car for rupees 5 lakhs, but it is not communicated to the intended person, B in the previous example. Then there is no contract, there is no agreement. So offer and acceptance has to be communicated. One can also revoke the offer before it has been accepted. It is not necessary that offer must be communicated in person. An offer can also be communicated in electronic form or email. Let's look at the next essential element which makes a contract, and that is consideration. An agreement without a consideration is void. What is consideration? Consideration means the price of a promise, a return, something which is of value by the offeree, received by the offeree. तो जो एक्सेप्ट कर रहा है टर्म्स को, कंडीशंस को, उसको भी रिटर्न में कुछ मिलना चाहिए. इट्स द प्राइस ऑफ द प्रॉमिस. कंसिडरेशन डज नॉट नीड टू बी The consideration does not need to be adequate, but it should be real. There should be some values in the eyes of law. उसके कोई ना कोई value होनी चाहिए. Consideration should also not be illegal or against the public policy. So consideration illegal नहीं होना चाहिए, immoral भी नहीं होना चाहिए, and it should not be opposed to the public policy. We'll learn more about that. Let us look at an example. But before that, the consideration must give benefit to both the parties, the plaintiff as well as the defendant. It could even be a detriment to stop somebody to do something. Now, who is a plaintiff? The plaintiff is the party or the person who has suffered the injury. And the defendant is basically the accused who is defending himself. अगर आप कोर्ट में जाते हो तो एक पार्टी प्लेंटिफ होता है और दूसरा डिफेंडेंट होता है. I hope it is clear by now. Let us look at an example. A offers to sell his car for 5 lakh. The same example which we understood earlier. B accepts the offer. अब यहां पे कोई चेंज नहीं है. B accept this offer. इसमें कंसिडरेशन क्या है बोथ पार्टीज के लिए? In this case, for A, the consideration is the car, but for B, it is the amount rupees 5 lakhs. And B accepted the offer in the same sense, car and 5 lakh rupees. So here it will make a valid contract or a valid agreement. Let us move on and look at the next element of contract, and a very important one. The capacity of the parties to enter into a contract. Not every individual can enter into a contract. It is very important to understand, is the party who is entering into a contract capable of? And according to Indian Contract Act, there are people who are barred from entering into a contract. But before that, let us understand that why this is happening. This is happening because the law, in its wisdom, restricts certain persons from binding themselves with responsibilities and promises. So, who can enter into a contract? So if you look at, according to Indian Contract Act 1872, only the people who have attained majority, and in case of India, it is 18 years of age. तो जब आप 18 साल के हो जाते हो, तो आपको एक major consider किया जाता है. You are no longer a minor. So people who have attained majority, or where court has appointed a guardian for the minor's person or property, in that case, the age is 21. People who are of sound mind at the time of making the contract. And people or the person was not disqualified from contracting by law itself. So capacity बहुत important है, capacity to contract. The ICA also specifies about people who cannot enter into a contract. So who are the people who cannot enter into a contract? Minors who are less than 18 years of age, people of unsound mind, lunatics, idiots, drunkards, and who are disqualified by law, aliens, foreign sovereigns, barristers, insolvents, convicts, and corporations. चलो आगे बढ़ते हैं और नेक्स्ट एलिमेंट को अंडरस्टैंड करने की कोशिश करते हैं. So which is the next element? The next element is consent. Free consent. That's the term. Free consent is very important to form a contract. So when two parties agree on the same thing, and be careful, and in the same sense, it is known as consent. Same thing and same sense. कोई भी एलिमेंट चेंज नहीं होना चाहिए. So whatever is being communicated by one party, the other party has to accept in the same way. Same meaning होना चाहिए, same मतलब होना चाहिए. कोई terms and conditions change नहीं होने चाहिए. This is also known as consensus ad idem, which means agree on the same thing in the same sense. So the parties agree on two different things or the same thing in different sense. The law considers there is no real consent between the parties. दोनों parties अलग अलग तरीके से सोच रहे हैं, both of them are thinking differently, then the law will consider that there is no real consent between the two parties, and hence there will be no contract. Let us understand this with an example. A has a horse named Diamond. A also has a car by the same name, Diamond, which means A के पास एक घोड़ा है जिसका नाम Diamond है और उसके पास एक कार भी है जिसका नाम Diamond है. A is interested in selling the horse. B, who is an avid racer, car racer, is interested in buying the car. So he negotiates with A and enters into a contract to purchase Diamond. What is happening here? There is an absence of agreement between A and B because both have different things, different sense in their mind. A is selling his horse, whereas B wants to buy the car. Both are of the same name and both have different sense in their minds. So there is no agreement between the two parties. If there is no consensus ad idem, or in the absence of consensus ad idem, the contract does not exist in the eyes of the law. So consensus ad idem is a very important concept which you must understand, must remember. If that is missing, there is no consent. Also, the consent has to be free. Free consent implies that the party accepting the offer and entering into the contract, तो जो पार्टी ऑफर को एक्सेप्ट कर रहा है और कॉन्ट्रैक्ट में एंटर कर रहा है, must have done so without any force or pressure from anyone, be it physical, be it mental. So consent का free होना बहुत important है. The consent has to be free. When the consent is considered to be free, if the consent is not caused by coercion, I put a gun on your head and make you sign a contract to sell your house to me for just rupees 5 lakhs, which is worth 50 lakhs. There is coercion. And if there is coercion, there is no free consent. Undue influence. We come across a lot of scenarios where one party has undue influence over the other. For example, a relation between a doctor and a patient. A doctor definitely has an undue influence on the patient. We put all our trust in our doctors, our family doctors. So whenever we are ill, when we go to the hospital, whatever the doctor says, we agree to that, isn't it? In fact, अगर हम इंडिया की बात करें, if we talk about our context, we treat doctors as gods. A relation between a spiritual advisor and a follower. You all know how blindly most of the followers go by their spiritual advisors. In such cases, there is always a chance of undue influence. And if there is any undue influence, the contract or there is absence of free consent. Fraud. An act done with an intent to deceive or even induce the other person. Mistake. If the contract is entered because of a mistake, it is considered to be void. Please understand, if the contract is entered because of mistake, it is considered a void contract. Whereas if there is coercion, there is fraud, there is undue influence, there is misrepresentation, the contract is voidable. Voidable at the hands of the second party, the offerer, the promiser who is accepting the contract or who is accepting the offer. So, Such second party can either accept or reject the contract. Till such time the party rejects the contract, it is valid and enforceable. So while the second party understands that the party has entered into contract because of coercion, fraud, undue influence or misrepresentation, the second party has all the rights whether to continue with the contract or move out of the contract. But by the time that party rejects the contract will be considered valid and enforceable in the court of law. The other essential element is lawful object. Lawful object का होना बहुत जरूरी है. Without lawful object, there will not be a contract. Now, what is an object? The object of the agreement. If that is unlawful, the contract is considered to be void. So, in what cases the object is unlawful? Let us look at those conditions. The object is lawful unless it is forbidden by the law itself, or the object is of such nature that if permitted, it would defeat the very provisions of the law. तो अगर उस ऑब्जेक्ट को अलाउ कर दिया गया और वो किसी लॉ को डिफीट कर रहा है, किसी लॉ के पर्पस को डिफीट कर रहा है, दैट ऑब्जेक्ट इज अनलॉफुल. The object is fraudulent in nature. It is by fraud, or it involves injury to the person or property of another. In such cases also, the object is considered to be unlawful. And the last is the court regards that object as immoral or opposed to the public policy. In such cases also, the object would be considered unlawful. Let's look at an example to understand it better. When a person borrows money to get his daughter married, and the daughter is a minor, in this case, such marriage is prohibited. And this is an important case, C.S. Rao versus K. Rajaram Mohan Rao, 1952. If you look at this illustration, what is happening here? This is clearly defeating the purpose of Child Marriage Restraint Act. In India, child marriage is prohibited. And what is happening here? The father is borrowing money to get the daughter married, but the daughter is a minor. और माइनर्स की शादी इंडिया में परमिटेड नहीं है. सो इट इज डिफीटिंग द लॉ इटसेल्फ, एंड इट इज ऑल्सो अपोज्ड टू द पब्लिक पॉलिसी. Hence, we do not have a lawful object in this case. Waiving agreements, which we will be talking about in the next session, they are unenforceable and hence invalid. I hope you have understood by now what we learned today. You now can easily differentiate between an agreement, a social agreement, and a contract. You have understood the concept of privity of contract and what are the essential elements of a contract. In the next lesson, we'll learn about wagering agreements and contingent contracts, how a contract is discharged, what are the different ways to discharge a contract, and damages for breach of contract. As I said earlier, law of contracts is one of the most frequently tested concepts in law entrance examination, and hence it is going to be a very important chapter in your preparation for the CUET examination as well. Before we end the session, I will leave you with a question you must find an answer to. Ragini sees a book in the display case at the India Book Center for rupees 250, and knowing this to be a great bargain, she rushes to buy the book and finds that the owner refuses to sell her the book. Ragini sues the bookshop owner. Can she do that? I am leaving you with this thought before we meet next time with the second part of the lesson, where we learn about discharge and damages in case of breach of contract.